We've spent the season guessing what the playoff committee will do, but after this weekend, we'll know. Rankings are released Tuesday, but games of consequence happen Saturday. We'll get you ready for the biggest matchups in the Big Ten, including number one at the Big House, plus the chaos tiebreaker scenarios we're likely headed toward in the ACC. Oh, and signing day is a month away. An absolutely loaded 247 Sports college football show starts right now. Some news ahead of the CBS Big Ten Game of the Week between Oregon and Michigan. Wolverines quarterback Jack Tuttle retired from football earlier this week. He announced his decision Monday, saying he needs to start prioritizing his health. Tuttle recently said that he suffered the fifth concussion of his career and did not fully recover from off-season surgery to repair a ligament in his throwing arm. Let's welcome in college football insider John Talty. And John, I know that you've looked into this trend almost with quarterbacks retiring early for health reasons. Tuttle, not the only one this week in particular, but what have you learned digging in a little bit deeper?
Yeah, we'll give you a little preview to a story that's going to air on CBS Sports next week. But, I think it's a little early to call it a trend. But if you look at Jack Tuttle deciding to retire this week, Grayson McCall, the North Carolina State quarterback, deciding to retire. And he, said publicly the other day that, he had suffered 6 or 7 concussions. And we're also coming up on the 1-year anniversary of JT Daniels, who I talked to this week. The former USC Georgia quarterback suffered a severe concussion at Rice last year, almost exactly a year ago, and ultimately had to retire because of it. So I think what we're seeing is, there's more awareness around the issue right now. So I think guys are more aware of, the long-term potential consequences of multiple concussions. They're trying to, make the decisions that best prepare them to be healthy as a, adult moving forward. The other thing that's kind of interesting, and I've gotten kind of mixed answers on this so far, so I don't know that it's still too soon to know maybe what the overarching impact is. But I think NIL does change things a little bit, and I've gotten mixed answers on it. But I think in one sense, these players having the ability to make money, whereas a decade ago they couldn't have unless they made it to the pros, could make it easier for them to walk away, to know that maybe I have $500,000, $1 million in the bank, whereas I would have had to maybe have pushed it to get to the NFL otherwise. The flip side, of course, and I think we're seeing this at the NFL level in the discussion around Tua Tagovailoa, is sometimes the money makes it hard to walk away. Tua making $50+ million a year, people kind of use that as a reason, hey, maybe he should keep playing. So the impact of NIL, I think, on these injury retirement decisions is still a little too early to know its full impact, but I think it certainly bears watching and might be playing an impact on some of these decisions.
I know from a fan perspective, I don't feel as bad about some of these players having to hang it up, knowing that they were hopefully fairly compensated while they played, as opposed to what we saw, about 5 years ago with this. I'm looking forward to reading that piece on CBSSports.com. And something, John, I feel like I read about weekly on CBSSports.com is about Billy Napier. The Gators, they're hitting their toughest stretch of their schedule. They've got 4 straight ranked opponents, starting with number 2 Georgia on Saturday. So let's just keep it simple. What can Billy Napier do to keep his job?
Well, as an industry source put it to me this week, this is where the rubber meets the road for Billy Napier. I think that he has, not exceeded expectations, but, we're seeing Florida still play hard, right? This is not a team that has given up on Billy Napier. We've seen some flashes with DJ Lagway. You can kind of talk yourself into the future, what it could look like with him. But ultimately, it's going to come down to whether Billy Napier can win any of these games. And, there's a little bit of a beauty contest effect here, too, where you don't want to get blown out in some of these games if you do lose. So particularly Georgia this weekend, you don't want to lose by 50 points, right? Because I think that immediately cranks up the hot seat, all the, anger and displeasure amongst the booster base. You got to look, competent against Georgia. And then ultimately, you're going to have to steal a game or two. I think Florida State looks way easier than we thought it was at the beginning of the year. It feels like that should be a win. I think those key games might be Ole Miss and LSU. If you can steal a win there, you can beat Florida State, you finish 6-6, go into the bowl. talk yourself into Billy Napier, coming back. And there are people around the industry that believe that he could come back in that scenario. But it's going to come back to, again, you have to win some of these games. And if you lose to a Georgia or a Texas, you can't look awful doing it where it feels like you're never going to be able to turn it around. So that to me is, I think, a crucial thing for this weekend is you can't look terrible if you do lose to Georgia.
So Florida and Billy Napier are not part of the coaching carousel, but it has already started to turn in this season. So who are some names maybe on the hot seat that we do need to keep an eye on?
Yeah, there's a few. It does feel like Billy Napier is the most prominent one right now. But I think one that I think is interesting, and my colleague and I, Matt Zenitz, wrote about it this week, is Dave Aranda at Baylor. It looked like with the way they started the season, Dave Aranda was had a pretty good chance to lose his job. Things were trending the wrong direction, but they've won their last two games. It feels like they've kind of stemmed that tide. And you look at the remainder of their schedule, it feels very winnable. You've got West Virginia, you've got Houston, TCU, Kansas. You feel like at minimum you should probably split those games. And if you can win maybe three, finish the year 7-5, go to bowl game, Dave Aranda's probably coming back in that scenario from the people that, Matt and I talked to this week. So, that's one that felt like it was potentially going to open up that now is trending towards safe. West Virginia is another one that I think Bear is watching. Mixed opinions, I would say, in the industry as to whether that job is going to open up. Neil Brown really doesn't have a bad loss this season, but, there's always been some talk around that job. And, he kind of worked his way off the hot seat last year, bought himself some goodwill. But you can tell with that job, it's a little tenuous, takes a loss or two, he kind of puts himself back on it. So, how he finishes, I think, could be important. But that one, at least right now, it's kind of mixed. You get different opinions from people in the industry. But those are two of the bigger ones that I think are, from that Power 4 level that bear watching beyond, of course, Florida. And really, Emily, where we've seen the biggest movement so far is at that group of 5 level. We already have 3 group of 5 jobs that have opened up, including, most recently Rice over the weekend.
You can read more about this Rice opening on CBSSports.com. I know you just released a story today about that. I was reading up on that beforehand, but we'll tell people to go to the website for that because I got one more question for you. I don't love talking about hot seat. I like this question a lot better. Who are some notable names, maybe in waiting to get that bump up, who we'll see mentioned for some of these potential openings?
Yeah, I think there's 3 that are worth mentioning here. I think 2 that, are kind of in a similar boat, and that's LSU offensive coordinator Joe Sloan and Clemson offensive coordinator Garrett Riley. These are 2 younger guys viewed as, strong offensive minds, could have opportunities at multiple of these job openings that we see right now. So you've got, Southern Miss, ECU, now Rice. I think both of those guys would have opportunities with those 3 jobs. I think what will be interesting for both Sloan and Riley is, what's worth, jumping for. Both of them in particular have ties back to ECU. Is that worth jumping for? Do you wait? If you can make a playoff run the way that, both of those schools could still potentially do, is it worth staying and then trying to propel yourself to something even bigger? So they're kind of in a similar boat. And then the last one I'll mention is former UAB head coach Bill Clark. He's another name that I think you could see mentioned with all of those different jobs. Went to, 5 bowl games in 6 years at UAB. That was a challenging job. He, was part of their resurrection when they got rid of the football program and then brought it back. He's been out of the game for the last 2 years, retired due to back issues. From what I've been told, he is eager to try to get back into the game. I think he's going to be very choosy about what kind of job he would be willing to take. I think he would love to be in the mix for ECU. I could see him being in the mix for Rice and Southern Miss as well. So we'll see what he maybe decides to do. But I think Clark's a guy who has had success, especially at that group of 5 level. It looks like he wants to get back in the game at this point, and could be a good program builder for a school that maybe doesn't have all the resources, especially in the NIL department.
Certainly proved it at UAB, building it from nothing to what it is now. John, thank you so much. I appreciate all the great news there. And if you have not already, be sure to pick up a copy of The Price. It is written by John Talty and Armin Katayan, and it is really a college football fan's guide to the chaos that has happened and really is still happening in the sport right now. You can find it wherever you get your books these days. Get a good look. This is the last iteration of Brad Crawford's playoff bracket projection on this show, because next Tuesday we're getting the real thing from the playoff committee. So we didn't see a ton of chaos in week 9, so not a ton of movement here. We've got Ohio State and Texas, swapping 5 and 6 spots, and Texas A&M jumps Indiana at 10 and 11, respectively. So let's go ahead and welcome in Brad Brackett's here to talk through his bracket. So the next time we talk, I said this, we'll have an actual bracket. So I'm curious, the one that you have now, is this what you think the committee will do or what you think they should do?
I think this is what the committee should do. Now, Ohio State, Penn State this weekend is the biggest game as far as playoff and conference title implications go. If Penn State beats Ohio State, I might just put Penn State in that top billing in the Big Ten ahead of Oregon. I've been impressed with the Ducks this season, but Penn State, if they're able to beat Ohio State and James Franklin, get off that, low streak against the Buckeyes, then maybe the Nittany Lions are the team to beat in that conference.
You mentioned what happens with a Penn State win. That would obviously help them out with the playoff and their Big Ten title race. But what would you do with a 2-loss Buckeyes team whose both losses would be to top 5 teams on the road?
That would be a predicament Ryan Day does not want to be in, Emily, because several SEC teams, I think, are going to end with 10 wins. Same 10-2 record. Tennessee is going to be one of those. They're going to have a win over Alabama. Those losses are going to be Georgia projected, and, of course, that game at Arkansas they lost. Notre Dame might be a 10-win team that Ohio State would have to contend with. But I do think Ohio State, if they lose Saturday at Penn State, if they beat Indiana, and Indiana's unbeaten later in November, that's going to be a quality win. Indiana's a team right now that I also have getting one of those at-large playoff bids.
Definitely not one of those what-if roads you want to go down at this point in this season, but it is interesting to think about. Meanwhile, Texas A&M, they're, of course, in your bracket, and they're on the road at South Carolina this weekend. Now, the Aggies are in the driver's seat to be in Atlanta to play for an SEC championship. So what do you need to see from them following that massive victory on Saturday?
I've been seeing a lot of narratives about this is a trap game for the Aggies, but I think South Carolina has Mike Elko's full attention. There's an open week for the Aggies next week. They play New Mexico State in mid-November before getting back into that SEC schedule against Auburn. So this is a game that the Aggies have to win to stay in that top spot in the SEC. It's a game South Carolina, only a 2.5-point underdog. They're in a big spot here, and Shane Beamer's had a couple big spot opportunities this season, namely Ole Miss at home, lost to LSU by 3 points at home, lost to Alabama by 2 points on the road. This is a underrated South Carolina team, one that's going to test Texas A&M up front. And Marcel Reed, he's already beaten one SEC team on the road this season at Florida. But going into Williams-Brice Stadium at 7:30 under the lights, that's going to be a tough matchup for the Aggies.
You mentioned all those almost wins for the Gamecocks. It just feels like they're going to break through at some point. Could happen on Saturday. Just more chaos in the SEC. Speaking of that, we'll talk about the chaos in the ACC right now, the fact that there are 4 ranked and undefeated teams in that conference. But I want to ask you how it pertains to the college football playoff. We've got 2 of those undefeated and ranked teams playing Saturday night, Pitt at SMU. So how could this game in particular affect that CFP race?
Yeah, I don't understand how Pitt is a 7.5-point underdog on the road against SMU, and Pitt's undefeated. Now, the quality wins maybe haven't been there for Pitt yet, but this is a major opportunity for Pat Narduzzi to prove to the selection committee before the first set of rankings come out that Pitt is one of the ACC's best teams. I know we've been talking about Miami being unbeaten. Clemson has that one loss, unbeaten in ACC play all season. Those are the 2 front runners. But very quietly, Pitt and SMU have also been just as good as the Tigers and Hurricanes. I'm expecting a very good game there in Dallas, Pitt and SMU. And the winner of this game, if it is Pitt, then the Panthers host Clemson in a couple of weeks. And that game, Emily, is the biggest of the season in the ACC as long as the Panthers win Saturday night.
All right. Thank you, Brad. Be sure to check out more of his work at 247sports.com. And next month, we have signing day. The transfer portal opens up and the coaching carousel heats up. So lock in to 247sports.com for the latest. The CBS Game of the Week pits #1 Oregon against the defending national champs Michigan. And we already played this game on EA College Football 25. We just couldn't wait. So you're getting a sneak preview of what it could look like when it's played for real Saturday at 3:30 on CBS. Talking more about this game, so let's bring in Matt Prem from Duck Territory and Sam Webb from Michigan Insider. And guys, we're talking matchups. Let's start with the Michigan offense versus Oregon's defense. Sam, we talked about this earlier in the season, so I want to check back in. How much closer is Michigan to finding that identity on offense?
Not a whole lot closer, Emily. It's been musical chairs at the quarterback position. As you well know, they started out with Davis Warren, then they went to Alex Orji, then they went to Jack Tuttle, who was obviously retired from football, then back to Davis Warren, and a combination of Davis Warren and Jack Tuttle. And I think what we're going to see this week is them kind of settle into more of a mixture, because what they discovered as they went along is that the mixture is going to have to be more from the beginning. And maybe they intended for it to be that way, because Michigan State coming out last week really dominated the first quarter of that game. Michigan only got one possession in the first quarter, 1 minute of possession time in the first quarter of that game. So you really couldn't tell what the plan was, because they didn't have the ball that much. And you really only saw Alex Orji in the second half of that game. But within that second half, you saw them understand that in order to run the football, you need Alex Orji in that game, because teams are they're going to send those safeties down in the box, and they're going to dedicate a safety to really impose their will to try to understand and try to slam down and slam down on that run game a lot. And when you throw Alex Orji, you get that extra blocker in there, and now you can run that football a lot more. And when you throw Davis Warren back in there, now you can throw that football down the football field a lot more. And that mix allowed Michigan to have a more coherent offense, and I think that's what they're going to try to do against Oregon this week.
Yeah, Oregon's been preparing for both guys. And you look at mobile quarterbacks with Alex Orji, this won't be anything new for this defense. They've played Michigan State. They've played Purdue, two teams that tried to use mobile quarterbacks against Oregon, and they excelled. Oregon's defense did. But Orji will be the most lethal runner that they have faced so far this season. Oregon players have talked about the eye discipline, playing in a phone booth, doing your 1/11th is what they like to call it. Don't over pursuing, keeping contained. Don't try to do someone else's job. Just do yours, because that's how you stop teams that can effectively run the football on first, second, and third down, is doing your own job and not trying to do too much. Now, with Warren in the game, Sam's right. Like, Oregon's going to bring safeties down. They're going to dare Michigan to throw the football. This is a team that held their own against Ohio State's receiving core and their passing attack, and that's nothing. Michigan doesn't come close to what Ohio State presented. So Oregon will load the box. They'll play 3, maybe 4 guys in pass coverage with Warren in there, at least early on, to see if they can push past Oregon's secondary there.
All right, we'll talk about the other side, Oregon's offense versus Michigan's defense. But before we get into it, our Jenny Dell, who will be on the sidelines for this game on CBS, caught up with Sharon Moore this week. Let's take a listen.
Yeah, I think you got to give them different looks, because they're going to make plays. They've got playmakers, at the receiver spot, the tight end spot, the running back spot. Their O-line's really good, and obviously the trigger man is as good as there is in college football. So you've got to keep him off balance in the looks that he gets. You got to be able to stop the run to try to make them a one-dimensional team, because when they're balanced, they're extremely dangerous. So we've got to try to make them one-dimensional and then get them into situations where we feel like we can try to affect them in the passing game.
All right, more talking about the plan to shut down Dylan Gabriel and this prolific Ducks offense. So, Sam, what do you think of that plan for Gabriel, and also just the Wolverines' ability to be able to execute it?
It's got to be a game of complementary football. Michigan has got to try to shorten this game and try to get to the fourth quarter. Their offense is a part of that, which, gets back to running the football on offense. And then on defense, you got to try to make this be long possessions. Don't allow them to hit big plays. And so don't get into this trap of trying to send pressure and letting them hit plays over the top. Make them be methodical. They can do it. They can dink and dunk you, and they can go on long, 11, 12 play drives, but make them do it. You have a front four that can get there. So do that. Lean on Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant to get there and make plays. Don't put pressure on your secondary. Those matchups will not hold. So rely on your front four to make plays. If they can't do it, fine, because that is your best matchup. If that doesn't work, tip your cap to Oregon. That is your only hope, that your front four can make plays, and see if that can get you home.
Yeah, this is going to be an interesting matchup. Michigan's front seven in particular is going to be as good as Oregon has faced all season, and it will probably be the best that they'll face. NFL dudes at all three levels for Michigan's defense, they will test Oregon. There will be challenges for this offense for Oregon to move the football. Now, I think that the tip of Oregon's spear here is they can be one-dimensional. They can throw the ball heavy. They did that against Boise State, and I completely understand Boise State's defense is nowhere close to what Michigan's is. But they've shown they can win games with just chucking the ball over the place, and they've shown that they can win games running the ball. I think what will be the key here for Oregon is the quick passing game. Very similar to what they did against Ohio State, who tried to only bring 4, maybe sometimes 5 guys. Is they went quick, and they got the ball out to their playmakers in space, whether it was screens or quick outs or slants, dump offs to their running backs, make the defense move horizontally across the football field, tire them out, and then, as they like to call it, jab, 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 and then hit the haymaker with Evan Stewart going over the top. That's going to be critical here. If Michigan can tackle, and if Michigan can force Oregon to go the length of the football field over 12, 13 play drives, and they still lose, then yeah, Sam's right, tip your cap. But that's the success here for Michigan. It's make Oregon drive the length of the football field. They have turned it over at times when they've had to do that. Michigan State did it to them twice. They drove the length of the field and then turned it over in the red zone. So it's going to be horizontal attacks by Oregon. It's effectively going to be their run game, but via screen or slants, and just let Tez Johnson in the slot, leads the country in touchdowns in the slot position with 7. Dynamic playmaker, and hit him over the top with Evan Stewart.
Michigan's defense also hoping that home field advantage in the big house will help assist on defense as well. Thank you both so much for the great breakdowns. We appreciate it. You can check out more of their work at the Michigan Insider for, shocker, everything you need to know about Michigan. And then, of course, Duck Territory for all things Oregon football. Elsewhere in the Big Ten, we got a huge one in Happy Valley between number 3 Penn State and number 4 Ohio State. Our 247 Sports team site reporters have you covered with the keys to victory. Guys?
There's so many dynamics to the matchup, but I can't avoid focusing on the psychology of this game for Penn State. You're talking about a group of players who were, potentially in middle school the last time Penn State won this matchup. There have been waves of recruiting classes who've come to campus telling us we're going to be the ones that take this program to the Big Ten championship, get them past the Michigans and Ohio States of the world. They were never able to get over that hump. And right now, already sensing some blood in the water with where the Buckeyes are, knowing what a loss would mean for Ryan Day potentially, Penn State has a huge opportunity against in front of a massive group of top talented recruits to finally end this 7-game losing streak, put it in the past for them. I don't know if it matters as much this year because a one loss on the season wouldn't knock Penn State out of college football playoff contention. They might be able to host a playoff game down the road, but this would put them in the driver's seat to get to Indianapolis for the Big Ten championship game, something they haven't done since the last time they beat Ohio State back in 2016.
And the keys for Ohio State will start with the rushing attack. Whoever wins the rushing battle, I believe, will win this game. But beyond that, Ohio State has been very pedestrian on special teams this year. Can they win the special teams battle? Their punter has decent stats, Joe McGuire, but a lot of it has been kind of, punts that have been 30 yards that might roll for 20 yards. So overall, they've been very shaky on special teams. Their field goal kicker is very shaky, Jaden Fielding. He had a game where he kicked 3 kickoffs out of bounds. He had a field goal attempt last week that he basically shanked into the stands. They've been a little shaky on punt returns. I don't know what they're doing with their schemes there. So can Ohio State at least have a stalemate or perhaps win the special teams battle? But Emily, I think it's really going to come down to the rushing attack. Whoever wins the rushing battle, unless there's some crazy disparity in the turnover battle, if one team has like 3 turnovers, the other team doesn't have any. I think this is going to come down to the rushing battle. Who's going to have the most rushing yards? Whichever team that is going to win this game in Happy Valley.
All right, you can check out more of their work here. Dave Biddle, who does a fantastic job covering Ohio State for Bucknuts.com. You can check out his work. And then, of course, Tyler Donahue, who is our guy at Lions 24/7. He has the absolute best coverage of Penn State football. So check out these great team sites. We are a month out from signing day, and the number one prospect is officially on Flip Watch. Could Michigan pull off a stunner? And in the ACC, we are taking out the rule book to see what the tiebreaker scenarios we could encounter and who is most likely to win the title. It's no surprise that with these super conferences, we're going to have some potentially wild tiebreaker scenarios. We're currently on a collision course for just that in the ACC right now. We've got Clemson, Miami, SMU, and Pitt all undefeated in conference play. So we asked our friend Bud Elliott to rank those 4 ACC teams he views most likely to win the conference title. So Bud, let's start at number 4. You've got undefeated Pitt.
Emily, I do. Pitt's been a great bounce back story this year. Last year, they were pretty terrible. This year, they remain undefeated. The offense has turned around a lot under new offensive coordinator Cade Bell. Eli Holstein's playing okay, the quarterback they brought in from Alabama. And Pitt's defense has returned to something resembling what Pat Narduzzi builds on defense. The reason I have them 4th, though, in the most likely to win the conference at this point is that they're the only team that will be an underdog of the 4 we're going to talk about today in any of its remaining games. And that game actually is this weekend at SMU. They're a 7.5-point underdog. SMU's been playing very well since the quarterback change to Kevin Jennings. If Pitt is somehow able to beat SMU this weekend, which again, 7.5-point spread is like, it's not David Goliath. They could overcome that. Then I think Pitt would vault up pretty good because their schedule within the ACC actually is fairly difficult.
You mentioned SMU. Makes this very easy to assume who you think is going to win this football game when you've got Pitt as the least likely and SMU as the second least likely. So what is it about the Mustangs that has you maybe slightly more confident in them to win this game over Pitt?
A lot of it is the quarterback change, I think. They were playing Preston Stone at the beginning of the year, and he was playing rather poorly. SMU's offensive line took a step back this year, so Stone's lack of mobility was not a great fit for an offensive line that was having trouble in pass protection. But Kevin Jennings is much more mobile. He's gone on the road a couple times, very battle-tested, played like really well at Louisville a couple of weeks ago. And the offense just seems to click a little bit more with Jennings. I think they also kind of returned to their tempo roots with Jennings, keeping it simple, getting up on the ball, snapping the ball. And the defense plays a really complementary style of football here to what SMU's offense does. They're very aggressive. They blitz a lot. If they give up a score, it's okay because the offense gets the ball back and they're trying to have as many possessions as possible. They also get a lot of tackles for loss, a lot of sacks, and a lot of turnovers generated. So I like what SMU has going on in terms of complementary football. I think they're just slightly better than Pitt. And, of course, that Pitt game is in Dallas. So that's why I have SMU at number 3.
That certainly helps having that home field advantage. Before we move on to the next 2 teams, I want to further clarify that this is the most likely you think to win the conference. But what are the chances we see the Mustangs in the conference championship based on the fact that they don't play either of these next 2 teams we're about to talk about?
It's non-zero, but it's not great because one of the ACC tiebreakers is conference opponent record. And right now, if we just stop the fight right now, SMU would actually be in based on the teams it has played so far. Unfortunately for the Mustangs, as you mentioned, Emily, they don't play Clemson. They don't play Miami. They do play a whole mess of teams that have a whole bunch of conference losses still to come on this schedule. So after Pitt, their final 3 games are a bunch of kind of like conference basement dwellers. And that's probably going to hurt their conference strength of schedule. So if SMU, Clemson, and Miami all remain undefeated, I'm pretty sure, like there's some uncertainty here, but I'm reasonably sure that SMU would actually get left out based on opponent conference record.
Yeah, but we're jumping ahead of ourselves with these tiebreaker scenarios. We'll discuss that in just a little bit. But let's start with number 2. You've got Clemson there. No Miami on the schedule, but they will face Pitt, as we have mentioned. So why do you have the Tigers at number 2?
A lot of it just comes down to schedule. If you put Clemson and Miami on a neutral site right now, it wouldn't shock me if odds makers had Clemson as a small favorite over the Canes, and you could argue the opposite of that as well. But as you mentioned, they do play Pitt. They also play Louisville. Okay, and not that Louisville's had a good year. They've certainly had a much tougher schedule than normal, but Louisville is capable, I think, of playing up. They almost knocked off Notre Dame despite the fact they had like a block punt and some just crazy turnovers and quite honestly, some game mismanagement there. Louisville's only a 10.5-point underdog this weekend in Death Valley. Like, that's not such a prohibitive dog that you got to think, oh, Clemson's automatic there. Clemson's automatic against Pitt. If you think Clemson and Miami are somewhat even teams or close to it, you have to look to the schedule card. And Miami's remaining schedule in conference is way easier than what Clemson's is. Clemson arguably has some of their toughest conference games left remaining, this weekend, and then obviously the game, as you mentioned there at Pitt. But Clemson's playing really well. If they make it through this, and again, the reason why I have them second, not first, is that schedule. If they make it through this, they're probably going to be favored in the ACC title game over the next team we'll talk about.
Yeah, you've got Louisville at home, then you go to Virginia Tech, and then you go to Pitt to finish out their ACC conference schedule. And on the other side, Miami, the team you think most likely to win the ACC championship, they don't play a single team with a winning record in conference play down the stretch. But what has you so confident in the Canes' ability to get it done with that schedule and in the title game?
So I like Miami's ability to be multidimensional on offense. Cam Ward got a lot of the attention early in the season, and to his credit, he should. Like, he played extremely well. But Miami also maintained a very high rushing success rate throughout the year, and now they're starting to kind of lean on that run game more as the offensive line gets healthy. I think they're not impossible to stop, but they may be impossible for ACC teams to stop consistently. And defensively, I don't have quite the concerns about Miami's defense against the teams on their schedule, at least. Maybe come playoff time, that'll be a different conversation. But you look at the Cal game. Miami almost lost to Cal, but if you go back, they were still top 10 in the nation that week in defensive success rate. What happened was they allowed like 5 plays of 60-plus yards, so it kind of skewed the numbers. And, of course, those count, right? Like, they're going to go in the end zone. Not a great idea to allow 5 plays of 60-plus yards. But on a down-to-down basis, I think Miami's defense has actually been playing a little bit better than some of the numbers have suggested. So that's why I have a lot of confidence in the Canes. I think they're peaking at the right time. They're getting healthier, and they have the far easier path to reach the title game.
All right, let's talk about some tiebreaker scenarios. I know you laid one out already with SMU and Miami and Clemson if they're all undefeated at the end of the season. But what is we're taping this around spooky season, so what's the scariest scenario for the ACC? What do they absolutely want to avoid when it comes to putting maybe some of those bigger brands and the teams that they want to have competing for their title?
Totally. I think they definitely want to avoid 3 undefeated teams at the end, being Miami, Clemson, and SMU, because that's all kind of messy, to be honest. And opponent conference record, but like, what about like record against common opponents? There's all kinds of things you would have to look at here. SMU left kind of out in the cold. It's not really their fault that their opponents that they played aren't nearly as good, as they normally are in some cases. Like now, granted, Clemson, Miami, and Florida State all play SMU, or excuse me, Clemson, Miami, and SMU all play Florida State. So like that's one common opponent. But there are other games they play where they don't have a common opponent. So I think there are definitely some messy scenarios here. If you are the ACC, I think the one you could stomach the most is maybe like a Miami loss, and then Clemson beats SMU in the title game, and Miami sitting there at 11-1. If you're the ACC, you really want to maximize the chance that you get at least 2 teams into the college football playoff, which I think they have a really good shot to do, to be honest, right now. So that, if I'm the ACC, that's what my eye's on.
Okay, I got to ask one more question as it pertains to the college football playoff. So if everything happens the way that we think it's going to, we've got Clemson and Miami competing in the ACC championship. We've got SMU just missing out but winning out the rest of their games, and then Clemson beating Pitt in that game down the stretch. How many teams does the ACC get in the college football playoff?
I think it's 2 because, as you mentioned, SMU sitting there with 1 loss. Who was that loss to? BYU. So there's a really good chance that it comes down to 11-1 non-ACC champ participant SMU, because they get left out of the ACC championship game, against maybe a 13-0, which wouldn't be a conversation. But what about a 12-1 BYU? What about an 11-1 BYU? 11-1 BYU or 12-1 BYU is probably going to trump 11-1 SMU, given that BYU literally beat SMU head-to-head in Dallas like 8 weeks ago. So I think 2 is the most likely answer. If Clemson beats Miami, then I think you have a really good shot to get 2, because I don't think they're going to leave an 11-1 Miami with a Heisman contender out of the college football playoff. Like, that's all kind of ratings, and obviously they have a lot of talent on that team. if Miami beats Clemson and Clemson's sitting there with 2 losses, then you start to kind of look at like, what are Clemson's best wins, which is tough to kind of consider, right? Like they have some decent ones, but some of the schedule has been rather weak. And then you may go back to what we talked about with the head-to-head SMU and BYU. So that's kind of the scenario. I think if you're the ACC, you want Clemson to beat Miami and Miami to be sitting there at 12-1, and I think they're going to get in.
Love it. Thank you, Bud. All my college football fans, make sure you are listening to the Cover 3 podcast throughout the season and off-season. Bud, Chip, Danny, and Tom have you covered with immediate reaction Saturday nights upon further review on Mondays. Big Ten show right here on CBS Sports Network on Tuesday. Big game breakdowns on Wednesday and best bets on Thursday. You can check them out on YouTube or listen wherever you get your podcasts. We are a month out from National Signing Day, and if you haven't been paying attention, we'll make sure you're all caught up with the storylines, the recruiting battles, and the top talent. With National Signing Day a month away, we're getting you ready to go by giving you the scoop and scout on some of the top players. National recruiting analyst Cooper Petagna is here to help us out. And where else do we start other than the #1 player in the class, quarterback Bryce Underwood? He has been committed to LSU since January, but it sounds like some schools trying to change that ahead of signing day. Before we get into that, though, Coop, start us off with the scout. What kind of player is Bryce Underwood?
Well, he's a phenomenal player. That's why he's the #1 player in the country, and he's been phenomenal this year. Coming off a tough loss this past weekend, but this guy is working his way very diligently towards win number 50 in his high school career. We talk about this all the time. Bryce Underwood could be in the class of 2026, but he's got everything that you want from the prototypical size and athleticism, and that's really kind of been the biggest revelation of Bryce Underwood as a senior. We've seen so much more with his legs and the athlete on the ground, and I think that is something that is super encouraging, whether you're an LSU fan or a Michigan fan. We'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. But Bryce Underwood is a complete package, and this is a guy that can ultimately step in from day one, compete for a starting job, and play and have an impact during his collegiate debut as a freshman. So he's been the complete total package from what we've seen as a senior in the last couple years. He's put an exclamation point on his high school career.
You mentioned Michigan. That's, of course, who I'm going to ask about in this race. He is a Michigan native, so we're always kind of wondering, where are the Wolverines in this race? Things tend to heat up as we get closer to signing day. So what do you know about his recruitment as it stands right now?
Well, I'm not the resident insider. In a perfect world, we'd have Tom Loy here, but Tom can't be here today. So he's passed along some nuggets to me. It sounds like Bryce Underwood is going to have a return visit to Baton Rouge in LSU. LSU's sending up their contingent of coaches. Joe Sloan certainly going to be the guy that's going to be spearheading that effort. LSU's offensive coordinator there. Those two obviously have a very close relationship, but it seems like Michigan is starting to kind of ramp things up. We've heard about the NIL package being on par with what LSU has put together, and we're talking about serious financial implications for the Underwoods in a positive way. So this, I would expect to continue to be a storyline that we're going to have to follow here throughout the next couple weeks, as signing day is almost close to 30 days away. So Bryce Underwood, Michigan, LSU, this is kind of what you would expect with a player of his profile. I expect those two programs to kind of duke it out over the next couple weeks.
I'm sure Michigan would love to have Bryce Underwood right now for their season under center. Meanwhile, let's go to the number 22 overall prospect, wide receiver Caleb Cunningham. He is committed to Alabama. As we know, the Tide are enjoying their freshman wide receiver right now. But Coop, what makes Cunningham such a can't-miss prospect?
Well, he's a bigger body in the fact that he's a stout kid. He's over 190 pounds. He's 6'1.5". He's got an elite basketball background, elite track and field background as well. And this is a guy that loves to play above the rim. So not only is he really, really strong at the catch point, but I love him after the catch as well. And this is a guy that can make people miss in the open field. He also has that top end gear. And we're really, really excited not only to see him at Alabama, Mississippi, but to get to see him at the Under Armour All-American game as well. That's going to be a really, really big evaluation for Caleb Cunningham, because right now the live exposure has been somewhat limited. But just in terms of everything that you look for, he's a certified freak, and obviously kind of fits the mold of what Alabama has there already with a 17-year-old that's been doing some pretty crazy things as a freshman.
Yeah, and Cunningham has been locked in with the Tide since July, but how much are they going to be sweating out this recruitment down the stretch as we near signing day?
Sounds like a good bid. It sounds like Hugh Freeze, Auburn are pushing. Ole Miss is obviously pushing as well, the in-state program. So I think anytime that you have elite receiver talent like this, and we got to remember, this is not the 2024 class when you go back and you had 7 5-star receivers. And we talk about those guys, Jeremiah Smith, Ryan Williams, or Ryan Wingos of the world. TJ Moore, you can throw it in that conversation. And along with Cam Coleman, this is a class that's a little bit skinnier on that top receiver talent. So guys like Caleb Cunningham, especially in the Southeast, and with those teams I mentioned, Alabama, Ole Miss, and Auburn, they're going to find ways to continue to stockpile elite receiver talent. It's really no shock, no surprise that all 3 of those teams are battling it out for one of the best receivers in the country.
Go back to quarterbacks. Top 10 QB Julian Lewis has been committed to USC since August of 2023, but you and I both know he has been on visits all over since then. We'll get to the scoop in just a sec, but let's start with what do we need to know about this QB?
Well, he's a winner, and I want to make that very clear. I mean, you watch Julian Lewis on Friday nights, it's hard not to come away so impressed, especially with the level that he's playing there at Carrollton High School in Georgia. And this guy's been doing this for a long time. I think it's, a lot of people forget that Julian Lewis reclassified. He should be in the class of 2026. But in terms of the decisiveness, the accuracy, playing from the pocket, he excels in structure, and he is just so mature beyond his years. He's been a great joy to watch this year. He's gotten better and better and better. And he's one of those guys, even being young for his age, and I mentioned that reclassification, he is probably pound for pound one of the more polished passers in the entire country. So it gives a guy like that with a pretty interesting recruitment. If you're USC, Indiana, Colorado, it's going to be one of those guys that I think could push for playing time pretty early.
Yeah, Colorado brought us the Juju burger, which looks absolutely delicious. There's, of course, been a strong flirtation with Indiana. You see what they're able to do this season. I'm sure that helps in his recruitment. So what's the latest on this prospect as it pertains to his recruitment ahead of signing day?
Well, I don't want to say anything I shouldn't say, right? Because this isn't my lane, but it sounds like Indiana and Colorado are the 2 teams kind of battling it out. And we know USC has been the team that he's been committed to for quite some time. But you think about the fit there, right? I mean, for Julian Lewis, it's an embarrassment of riches in terms of the options. You go play for Lincoln Riley, one of the best quarterback developers around in the country. You got Kurt Cignetti, Indiana. They're 8-0 right now. Who would have thought they would have been in that spot? And then Colorado, you think about the job that Deion Sanders has done in year 2, and then potentially to have the opportunity to replace a first-round draft pick in Shedeur Sanders. It's a great responsibility and a potential great opportunity for Julian Lewis to step into any of those spots, be handed the reins, and he's got some great options there to choose from. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens with Julian Lewis and those sweepstakes and kind of how they play out.
Really can't lose in that situation. All right, it's not just about the offensive players. Let's hit on one defensive player. Defensive lineman Jakeem Stewart. He is one of the top uncommitted prospects as a 4-star. What kind of player will one lucky school land?
Well, his nickname is Young Thanos, and if you know anything about the comic book, The Avengers, you know Thanos is an absolute problem. And this kid is a problem. That's what he is. I mean, he's 6'6". He's over 270 pounds. He's got over 34-inch arms. He's got big old hands at 10 1/4, and he can move people quite easily. The big problem with Young Thanos is he hasn't played a lot of games. I think he's played like 11 high school games. This is another guy that's going to enroll early, reclassified. So as much as you're in love with the idea of Jakeem Stewart and what he can be, we haven't seen a lot of kind of on-field action, right? So this is a really kind of interesting case study for a lot of teams out there where they have a player and a prospect that they really like, but in terms of the on-field experience, it's lacking. So in terms of expectations, I think they need to be tempered, but in terms of the potential of a kid like this, it's sky high.
It's the young part of the young Thanos. And also I said that he is uncommitted. So who are some of the schools involved in his recruitment?
Well, I think there's a couple still hashing it out here, but I believe it's Oregon and Dan Lanning and Tosh Lupoy doing the best job with him so far, according to Tom Loy. You got in-state LSU, who's obviously all in on a guy like Jakeem Stewart. They need to get better on the defensive line. You got USC as well, and their defensive line coach Eric Henderson, who used to coach Aaron Donald. And you think about Ohio State and Larry Johnson, right? These are all teams that are in on Jakeem Stewart. Like I said, one of the best pure prospects we've seen at the defensive line position in quite some time. There's some other things, variables that you got to sort through when you're talking about projection to Saturdays and beyond. But yes, the cream of the crop in terms of the blue bloods, all in on Jakeem Stewart.
I love it. Coop, thank you so much for providing both the scoop and the scout. You will be a huge part of our all-day signing day coverage on the 247 Sports YouTube page. So mark your calendars for December 4th. Thank you so much. You can also check out tons of great content on our YouTube page. You can find more from our network of insiders, analysts, and scouts. Join the nearly 500,000 subscribers and check out the 247 Sports YouTube page. Thank you so much for watching. Enjoy the games.